Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. Today is the sixth day since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia began, and we are joined today by Dr. Claudia Major. She is the head of the International Security Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, otherwise known as the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, or SWP, based in Berlin. Claudia, herzlich willkommen.
Dankeschön.
It is wonderful to see you again, although I have to admit, I wish the circumstances were different. We are seeing dreadful images coming from Ukraine, and we're seeing something that we thought we would never see again, namely major armed conflict in Europe. This week has also seen a radical shift in German foreign and security policy, when on Sunday, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke at a special session of the Bundestag and committed to delivering weapons to Ukraine, increasing Germany's defense spending, and also reducing Germany's dependence on Russian oil and gas. And I'm sure that in the course of our conversation, we will get to a number of those topics. But before we talk about German and European policy at the moment, let's talk a little bit about how things are going in Ukraine. The Russian invasion, which is the biggest assault on a European state since World War II, seems to have failed to achieve an early decisive gain that Vladimir Putin had hoped for. Russia is facing increasing international isolation over its invasion of Ukraine, and the hours of negotiation between the two sides yesterday failed to reach a breakthrough and to halt the fighting. So, Claudia, from your vantage point in Berlin, can you talk a little bit about how this is unfolding and what we might expect in the coming days or even weeks?
I think the sentences which I used the most over the last days is, I don't know. So I will also start this time now. What Putin really wants, how he's going to proceed, we don't know. Pardon. What we can try is to kind of bring various points together and make sense of it. And if you look at the previous political statements that Putin made, there seems to be three broad objectives which he had when he entered into that conflict, into that war. And it seemed to be first the control over the Donbass, second the control over Ukraine as an independent country, or the end of Ukraine as an independent country, and what I call redrawing European security order, so kind of totally changing the settings in Europe again. If those three things are correct, then the first has been achieved. So the control over the Donbass, that's done. And he's in the second, which is kind of controlling Ukraine. The military invasion, which we have seen, which in that scope, I think at that time, nobody really expected, didn't advance as quickly as apparently he hoped, because the Ukrainian resistance was much stronger. The support for the Ukrainians from the outside, from the Western country, was bigger. So there was a kind of stopping moment. And what we expect now, or what we have seen since yesterday, is a kind of second wave that comes with far more power, with far more artillery, focusing also of the cities like Kharkiv. And the overall goal seems to be Kiev, so to take Kiev, the capital. If we put that together with the nuclear signaling he did over the last week, then we should take those advances very seriously. We have been very concerned about this kind of triple nuclear signaling. There was this, why I say triple? I say triple because there was this exercise with nuclear capable rockets a week ago. Then there was this major speech some days ago where he said, if someone gets into my way, you will see consequences which you haven't seen. And the third was putting the deterrence forces on alert, I think yesterday or the day before. Something to be concerned about, not something to panic about, but something to be concerned, and which is mainly interpreted as a kind of nuclear coercion to show how important that war is to Putin. And that he more or less says to Ukraine, beware, I'm serious. And to the Western states, hands off. Don't get into that conflict, that's mine. So if you take those various elements together, the big fear is if the real objective is to control Ukraine And if you look what he said yesterday, he said he wants a demilitarization of Ukraine. That means turning Ukraine into in German, I would say Vasallenstaat. How do you translate that? Into kind of Vasallenstaat, into kind of not a real state.
Not a real, a puppet.
Yeah. Then he will continue. So this second wave is likely to be very, very brutal and ugly until he reaches his goal. That's the horrible conclusion from that.
I mean, one of the reports that I had heard this morning was of a convoy of some 40 miles in length of military forces that were coming from Russia to the front lines. And of course, that's a huge concern to have, is that this conflict will get even worse. I mean, as you said, that it will get even more brutal and ugly than it already is. But it seems as if there might have been a little bit of a miscalculation on Putin's part, but perhaps also on the part of the Russian military. And it seems from some of the reports that I think I've been reading in the German press and in the US press, the Russian military was not prepared for the kind of resilience and resolve it has faced from the Ukrainians. There have also been some anecdotal reports of Russian soldiers who thought that they were on a training mission and did not think that they were about to invade Ukraine. And even though they are up against a much stronger and more modern military, the Ukrainians are fighting back with tremendous effort. How is that sort of playing out, and how much worse do you think it will get in the days ahead?
I find it very difficult actually to rely on the information we get because this conflict really takes also place in the information sphere. There's a big attempt to get control over the narrative, control over the truth, more or less control over the pictures, control over the images. So we really have to be aware this conflict is also an information conflict. Yes, there have been news about young Russian soldiers didn't know where they were, where they went, and so there have been lots of reporting which makes you wonder about the Russian preparation or a certain Russian hubris, hybrid, you said that kind of arrogance to think this would just go like that. I think there is, even with all the caution I have to, with regard to the information, I think there's one thing that we really know is that the support since the start of the war for the Ukrainian president has rocketed. It's above 90%. There's a strong support. Also with social media, he succeeded in really presenting himself as the natural leader. And he's present. He was able to unify his country, to give it power to really lead the resistance. And that is amazing. So you have a enormous strong support on the Ukrainian side with a lot of donations given to the armed forces, a lot of volunteers for the reserve forces. So you can really feel this national support, the conviction we are defending our own country. And I think this mental difference between an army invading and a country fighting for its freedom, you had the big oligarchs given millions to the state budget in Ukraine. So I think this element of, in the most positive way, of patriotism is not to be underestimated. And to come back to your point, so how is this going now? What's now going to happen if they march towards Kiev? I think the question is, you could probably think of three scenarios. You could say in the best case, you get some kind of how you call that, stop fighting for a certain moment, not capitulation, but a kind of
ceasefire.
Exactly, ceasefire. You could maybe reach that. That was the talks we had yesterday between the Russians and the Ukrainians. So a ceasefire to just stop for a moment. You could see a real Russian major advance and a Russian probably victory. Or third, you could see something like not really an advance, not really a resistance. So a kind of inter blocking, and then you could think of scenarios like Syria or Grozny, and neither of them is really, but both are horrible. But even if Russia were to take Kiev, there would still be resistance in the western areas of the countries. So however you turn it around, this is going to be a long-term conflict. This is not going to end anytime soon, and it's not going to end in a very nasty way. So I think this is what we need to mentally prepare. This is going to be long-term, ugly, and terrible.
So related to that, we actually just got a viewer question. One of our viewers writes, the war is expensive. How long do you think Ukraine can finance this war and the consequences of the conflict?
I don't know. It's true, but it's also true for Russia. And Russia has the sanctions. The sanctions kicking in and already affecting a Russian economy and will very quickly affect everyday life. We have the bank run already, but that will quickly affect the kind of really what you can feel in everyday life in Russia. So I think the financial argument counts for both, with the difference that Ukraine gets the support from its own people, but also from the international community. And this is something which I wouldn't underestimate. How long it can actually still finance it, I can't tell you. But I think the difference, the two main points is it affects both sides, Russia and Ukraine, second, gets the real support from the Western world. And really the donations they got in the first days were amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Western resolve and the Western support for Ukraine has been quite impressive. But one of the questions that I have, and one of the questions that one of our viewers actually just submitted is how long will the West sort of sit on the sidelines and watch what is going on and what is undoubtedly going to be a brutal conflict in Ukraine?
The US and NATO both made it very clear that they will not enter a conflict in Ukraine. So that statement was made in a clarity, you couldn't hide. That was very obvious. You could obviously say so many wetlands have been crossed over the last day, and I'm saying that as a German because I never expect our defense budget go beyond 2% overnight, right. So who knows? But I think the main reason why NATO and the US decided not to engage in Ukraine is the fear of entering into conflict with a nuclear power. We have in NATO 3 nuclear powers, the US, the UK, and France. And on the other hand, we have Russia. So the reason why NATO and the US said we don't go into Ukraine was exactly that reason, to avoid a major war in Europe. The really interesting question for me are two behind. The first one is how long is our unity in the West? And with the West, I mean in Europe, among Europeans, and we don't always agree, so that's really amazing. And transatlantic, how long is this double unity to stay? And the second is, what if we have a spillover on allied, that means NATO territory, intended or unintended? And these are the questions where I think this is what we need to watch out, and which worries me a lot.
Yeah, and I think there's cause for concern about many different things unfolding, some of which you've talked about just now. But the other real question that I have as well is, you talked about the nuclear signaling, the fact that there's cause for concern but not yet panic. But there's also been discussion about whether or not Russia might use some of its thermal weapons, like the ones that were used in Syria, and that would have a tremendous impact on a city like Kiev, but also on other cities in terms of the loss of life, but also the destruction. Do you think it's likely that Putin would make that move?
I don't know. I don't know how many times I said that sentence already.
Yeah.
I really don't know. I obviously hope he would not. I think the problem after the last days and weeks is we can't exclude anything. I didn't expect Russia to march on Kiev. I didn't. I expected that he would just continue his destabilization tactics, which he had since 2014 on Ukraine. Sorry. Yes, Russia has been destabilizing Ukraine since 2014 with economic pressure, with fake news, with cyber, with military incidents at the line of contact. So I really didn't expect a major military operation of that scale. I didn't expect rockets in Kharkiv. So I think the unfortunate answer is, or the unpleasant answer is, we can't exclude it. Mm-hmm. It would change the nature of that war again considerably.
So let's shift gears slightly and come to Germany, because one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about is this major speech that Olaf Scholz gave before a special session of the Bundestag on Sunday. And in many ways, he outlined what could be described as a new blueprint for German foreign and security policy. And what he said was really kind of jaw-dropping in many ways for those of us who have followed German foreign and security policy. What stood out for you thinking about the 29 minutes that Olaf Scholz spoke and the way in which he really turned Germany's position by 180 degrees?
If I look at this speech, my impression was we really, in a very calm German way, we are doing a revolution. And we Germans are not good in doing revolution. Normally we fail. So I was really amazed to have a kind of Sunday morning speech of the Chancellor in an extraordinary session of the Bundestag, and one after another putting away traditional German positions. So the four major takeaways from this speech for me was Germany will create a special fund for big procurement projects in the armed forces, 100 billion euros. In second, so this is a kind of special fund we are going to create. The second leg is Germany will increase its defense spending to be above 2% starting from this year for many years to come. We are now at about 50 billion euros defense budget. If you would increase it to 2%, we would reach about 70. So this is not peanuts. That's an amazing step. And the 2% debate has been toxic in Germany for years. So just like this. The third element, he mentioned some major projects that Germany is going to tackle, including procuring the dual capable aircraft. That's the aircraft that allows Germany to participate in the nuclear sharing in NATO, which has been a big debate, a major controversial debate in Germany. And he announced that we are likely to procure, not yet decided, but likely to procure the F-35, which had been taken off the race in the past, and is as toxic as the 2% debate in Germany. So if you really want to kill a conversation, some weeks ago in Germany, you say 2% and F-35. It were topics that didn't work. Plus, Germany will procure armed drones. Again, a very controversial topic in the German debate. So what he did is really kind of totally change the financing of the German defense policy, and he announced projects which have been highly controversial for many years. And that shows for me really the extent of the crisis. For Germany, what's happening in Ukraine now is what we call in German a Zeitenwende. Mm-hmm. It's the change of an era. In Germany, in Europe, it feels in the moment that the period we had from the end of the Cold War, 1990, until now, this moment of a kind of cooperative security order with Russia is over, because Russia abolished that cooperative order with Russia. And what we have now, we enter a new unknown confrontative order, which we didn't want, which we still have to think what it means. But Germany kind of said, we understood this is a major change.
Related to this, one of our viewers submitted a question asking how we should read this German shift towards spending more on defense over the next few years. On the one hand, this is a major symbolic effort, right, that Germany is committing to 2% of GDP spending on defense. As you know, working in this field, it's about time that Germany invested more in its Bundeswehr. But it will take a while, as this viewer writes, it will take a while for the German military spending to ramp up, but also for the German military to ramp up. And it might not have an immediate impact on the current conflict over Ukraine. So how do you sort of put that in context? Is this symbolism, or is there some real might that Germany could have at its fingertips?
think we have to separate two things. The one is the now short-term crisis reaction. Now Germany delivers arms to Ukraine, and I actually it took some numbers that were published today. And the numbers published today, the polls say 78% of the Germans now think it is good to deliver weapons. 78%. I mean, that's amazing. We also have 78% who think it's good to increase the defense spending. And I can tell you the numbers last year, that time, nothing at all of that. Yeah. Defense spending was a kind of dirty child of the schoolyard. Nobody wanted to increase it. So I think, so we have the kind of short-term crisis reaction, and that is support delivering weapons to Ukraine. And then we have the long-term rethink of German defense policy. And the investment with the special budget, 100 billion euros, plus increasing the defense budget on a constant level for many years, this is the long-term answer. This is preparing for a different future in Europe. So I think we should not mix those two. If you think about the long-term change of German defense policy, the first and most important step is the mindset change, is to recognize, particularly we in Germany, in the US, it doesn't surprise anyone, but in Germany, it is to recognize that military power is a tool in our toolbox. We don't have to like it, but if we have a neighbor who is willing to move borders by force and wages a war on its neighbor, we are better equipped, not because we like it, but we have to be able to defend ourselves. So this is a mindset change, which now under the acute crisis, everybody says, yes, but this long term, if it arrives in kind of public mind, how much money that is, 70 or 80 billion, and it probably is then less money somewhere else. This process needs to be accompanied by the politicians, also by think tankers, just to explain why it is necessary. Otherwise, this will not work. Otherwise, it will be a failure in 1, 2, or 3 years. So even before we come to making sense of that money, the first step is creating the mindset to recognize we live again in a world of power politics. Even if we don't like it, we have to be able to survive in that world. And then we come to the kind of implementation level and have to say we have, even throwing money at the Bundeswehr, at our armed forces, doesn't make it happy day one. That will take years. Because procurement projects take years, and because we have so many holes from previous budget cuts, that we are just filling holes now. And we have a wrecked procurement system. So even if we have a lot of money, in the moment, we don't spend it terribly wisely. So it sounds like a good news, and it is good news. I'm not going to question that. But the real homework really now is starting. It's rethinking really our defense policy in many dimensions.
So I'd like to unpack the public response a little bit, because obviously this is, I mean, as you said before, this is a Zeitenwende, right? This is a major policy shift. And it's one thing for the government to make that change, but it's another thing to bring the public along. I was speaking with somebody yesterday who said that she thought it was going to be a very difficult sell by the government, by Olaf Scholz, to the German public, to really have this radical increase in defense spending. And so I was quite surprised by the Forza study that you quoted, of 78% of those saying that they think it's a good thing that that the government is making this incredible investment. And so I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about what the reaction has been to the Scholz speech, but also to the implications of that and the fact that there is a lot of work ahead as Germany tries to navigate these different points that you discussed, you know, the 100 billion for the Bundeswehr, the 2% defense spending, the drones. I mean, these are a lot of contentious points that have been on the table for years, and yet it seems as if there's really a tremendous breakthrough. How can you talk a little bit more about sort of the political response in Berlin? Because while there was some clapping during the speech, there was also some booing at some of the points when Scholz was speaking, but also sort of the more public response.
I try to. If you have time and can watch the speech, even if you don't speak German, just the atmosphere in the parliament is amazing. It really is amazing. You have the typical critical voices from the far right and from the far left, but even the far left to a large extent supported it.
Mm-hmm.
So the real outsiders were really the far right. I don't have any illusions. This unity will fade away at some point. So, and the unity will fade away. We will have the typical problems with big military projects, with bribery, lobbyism, and being too late and too expensive. So all this is going to come. But this overarching unity, really moving on topics, 2%, drones, nuclear capable aircraft, in so little time, topics that have been controversial for decades, nobody expected that. And apparently also not everybody in the government was informed about the scope of the decisions to be taken. Okay. So far, if you look at the numbers, the support for those decisions is enormous. And I think to a certain extent, it's explained by another number from that poll, is that 70% of those questions fear that the war will spill over. And I think we cannot underestimate the fear of war in Europe. I mean, I'm in Berlin. Kiev is almost closer to me than Rome. It's really the next country. You have Poland and then comes Ukraine. The refugees arrived in Berlin. Mm-hmm. So this is war in a European country. It feels close. It feels, and it pains me to say, it feels closer than the war in Syria. So I think the level of being affected as normal population, seeing pictures of a city like Kharkiv shelled by rockets, and this city looks like a German city, an Eastern German city maybe, has an effect on the people. And I think we should really not underestimate the level of being concerned of the population. And I think this explains why the opinion has shifted so much on weapons delivery, because the population was against it, and on the 2%, where again, the population was against it for a long time. So I think seeing that Germany had in the last weeks to accept that many ideas, which we think were kind of bulletproof, didn't work. Germany always called for dialogue with Russia. We were convinced if we only work closely enough with Russia, Russia would become like us. They would become politically democratic, economically liberal, and there would be a responsible international actor who respects the rules and even enforces rules. And Germany invested a lot in that, and recognizing that it didn't work, and we failed, that our ideas of international relations failed, or Russia kind of walked out. That's really a shock of our understanding of ourselves and of our European order. And I think this shock is really, really strong. And I think sometimes Zeitenwende, so change of times, is almost too soft, because really what we see here is something we never expected to happen in Europe again, such a war. And the reaction is enormously strong. The concern is strong. And I think this is a moment actually which the government should use to communicate about defense, to communicate on why we have armed forces. Why do we need them? What role do they play? So I hope this moment will be used, because what we have in front is defining a new security order in Europe. Recognizing that our old grammar of a cooperative security order doesn't work, and we have a confrontative one. What is the grammar of a confrontative security order in Europe? Political terms, economic terms, and military terms. So that's the big questions ahead.
That's the big question that a relatively new government has to answer, right? And a relatively complex government. It's important to remember that Olaf Scholz and his traffic light coalition have only been in office since December. I would have assumed that there had been close coordination with coalition partners prior to the speech. For the Greens, this marks a major turnaround. For the Free Democrats, it was interesting to hear the finance minister and the head of the FDP, who's obviously in charge of the budget and the financing, talk about how important it is that Germany have a strong and a modern military. So it seemed as if there was some coordination, but it was interesting to hear you say that some people were taken by surprise by some of the details in the speech that Olaf Scholz made. And one of our viewers would be very interested in hearing a little bit more about sort of this multi-party within the government response to the speech, and how you think things might play out after sort of an initial period of unity as things move forward.
Yeah, and we have now this, under the acute pressure of the acute crisis and the war, we have this unity, which is strong. But I think as soon as the kind of external pressure goes a little bit down, and we understand, so the situation in Ukraine maybe calms down a little bit, or in the worst case, it goes on and on and on, and we develop some kind of fatigue, as we have seen with other crises, and to a horrible extent, we get used to these horrible pictures from Ukraine. It's something we can't exclude. And I fear that the unity then will fade again, and then the kind of differences within the coalition will surface again. And the opposition, the Christian Democrats, the conservative opposition that so far said, we support you, will have to play its opposition game again. So I think the moment of really determination and unity, which we have now, we know it's not going to last. The only question is how long it's going to last. And it lasts the longer, the stronger the external pressure is. But I expect to come it up again. I mean, the left of the Social Democrats were utterly unhappy. The day before the 2% increase of the budget has been announced, we still had leading figures of the Social Democrats saying that more military is not the solution, that an arms race is not the solution. So these differences they didn't disappear. They are still there. And as soon as the external pressure leaves, they will come again. And we have to say that also, I mean, we have an excellent foreign minister and excellent minister of economics who also put very clear words and said that freedom has its price. For example, we know that the sanctions will fire back also on the German economy, and that Russia is likely to take counter sanctions. So we will feel it in Europe and in Germany. So the question is, what's the effect on the budget? We will not be able to finance everything. And it might come with higher prices in several areas. So the population will feel it. And the question is then, how long this solidarity with Ukraine, and we pay the price for the freedom, how long will it last? When it affects your own budget.
I guess my last question at the moment about sort of purely German politics is, do you think that it had to be a government headed by the Social Democrats with the Greens to enable this sea change in policy? Would something like this have been possible with the Christian Democrats in government? Or do you think it's too sort of hypothetical because the circumstances are really very much what has driven this shift in German policy?
There's an interesting historical parallel which you might have had in mind. This is when Germany went to war over Kosovo in 1999. That was in the first months of the red-green government with Joschka Fischer at that time in 1998, 1999. So there seems to be a certain idea that big steps in German security and defense policy might come with red-green, and in this case, liberal governments. I think it's difficult to speculate. We don't know. But so far, I think this government mastered that step very well. There was disappointment, including from my side in January, when there were doubts about where Germany stands, about Germany's reliability, because Germany was a bit not outspoken enough on the criticism on Russia, not outspoken enough on the support on Ukraine, kept Nord Stream 2 too long away from the sanctions basket, and countries were wondering where Germany really stand. And the communication was bad, the content was bad, and there was a certain disappointment that the new government didn't manage better. I think Scholz kind of managed to restore credibility, first by his visit in Washington, then the visit in Kiev, then the visit in Moscow, then when he said we put Nord Stream 2 on the sanctions basket, in the sanction basket, even before the European Union announced its sanctions. So it was taking back leadership. And when I watched actually this speech on Sunday, to a certain extent, I had the impression this is a moment where he really became the leader and the chancellor, really the one who said, this is the way I want to go and you follow me. It was, we Germans don't like to talk about that much about leadership like in the US, but this really felt like a moment of leadership. And I hope that this clear positioning, there's no doubt about where Germany is going and where it belongs, that this will continue after the unfortunate moments in January. But that was a really powerful moment where we had the impression this is a chancellor in charge.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the way he came across after people really questioning where he was and what his position was on this. So one topic that you've touched on briefly, but that we haven't really talked about that also relates to the speech is that Olaf Scholz talked about reducing Germany's dependence on Russian oil and gas as being an important factor. And we've gotten a number of different questions from people who are very curious to hearing a little bit more about how Germany is dealing with its dependence on Russian energy sources, how the Green Party in specific will approach energy in light of this conflict, and how Germany will deal with higher energy prices, which it has already started to feel, but which will undoubtedly go up in the weeks and months ahead.
There were also some elements on this question in the speech on Sunday, because, for example, Chancellor Scholz announced to build new LNG terminals. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea of we need to diversify our energy supply was one of the topics he touched upon and which he made very clear. The question which obviously came up in Germany was then, shall we rethink nuclear energy? That was quickly refused from the Ministry of Economics. So I think this might be a step too far, but I think there's now a clear conscience that first we will feel it in financial terms. There will be repercussions, and that we have much quicker and with much more determination to diversify our energy supply on the national level and on the European level, obviously. Mm-hmm. And when I said we have a new security order and more confrontative, more against Russia, that's what I would put in the kind of economics pillar. We have the political pillar, how we're going to interact with Russia in the future, on what terms. We have the economic pillar, how are we going to organize our economic and financial situation after the sanctions, with the sanctions. How are we going to diversify, for example, energy? How are we going to organize it? And the third pillar would then obviously be the military. But I think this is really, we have to think it in a bigger picture of how does a new order look like? And in each pillar is a lot of probably very expensive and long-term work to do.
Thank you for that. And obviously talking about energy policy at this moment could fill an entire hour, if not much more time in and of itself. And it's an important aspect. I had wanted to talk to you a little bit about the European response as well, because it seemed interesting listening to Olaf Scholz that he made a deep commitment in his speech to cooperation with Europe and with the United States. And he underscored strong ties both to France and to the United States. And one of our viewers submitted the following question: given that we've entered a new era, what are Germany's expectations of the United States regarding economic and defense policy toward Europe as it concerns Russia and China? And do they view both Russia and China as aligned in imposing a political and economic counterweight to the US or to the West?
I think that the German-American relationship has always been a very special one, for historical reasons also, because somehow the Americans allowed us Germans to go back to the family of respected states after the end of the Second World War. And the German foreign policy was always based on two pillars. The one was the European, with the European Union and France mainly, and the second was the transatlantic with NATO and the US. So this is a crucial relationship. And this is also why the Trump years have been so extremely difficult for Germany, and why Biden's election was welcomed with so much relief and so much enthusiasm. So from a German point of view, the idea that the US would really pivot, concentrate, whatever you want to call it, on China and on the systemic rivalry with China, because this is the main challenger in economic, political, military, whatever you want to call it, technological elements. This idea for Germany was always understandable, but worrying. So the idea that the US might turn away from Europe is something that had always a frightening touch on Germany. And if you look back to last summer 21, and the withdrawal from Afghanistan, this seemed to be the example of what we didn't like at all. Coordination between the US and Europeans didn't work. From a European side, we had the impression we didn't matter. It was the example that the US was looking towards Asia and everything else didn't matter anymore. And certainly Europe didn't matter. And that was a kind of very negative takeaways Germany took from Afghanistan. Also, the takeaway, Europe is not ready. Without the US, Europe is not ready in defense terms. Mm-hmm. And then came AUKUS, whenever you remember. AUKUS, right. This famous thing, the famous alliance between the US, the UK, not longer an EU member, by the way, and Australia, and for which Australia killed the deal it had with France. This deal was announced the day the European Union announced its own Indo-Pacific strategy. So again, the impression in Europe was the US is only worrying about China. It doesn't care about Europe. It doesn't even care about many allies. It might care about the UK, but it's not longer a European ally. So we doesn't care about Europe, doesn't care about European allies, doesn't care about coordination. Whether it's a crisis of competence, they don't get their work done properly in the administration, or it's a crisis of commitment, they don't care about Europe. Both things disastrous. Mm-hmm. So the idea in Germany was, the US is really turning away. That's not good news. It doesn't work. What we have seen in this crisis is a US that is coordinating a maximum with its European allies, a US that is back in Europe with clear leadership. It cares about Europe and it cares about a European war. So from a German perspective, this is a big relief. Mm-hmm. But in the same time, there's an enormous worrying that this might be the last time the US is back to save us. And we are not yet ready.
So in a sense, it ties in with what you were saying earlier about the need for Germany, but also for Europe to redefine its security structure moving forward, and yes, that NATO might not be as reliable as one had hoped, or one might think.
I think NATO is reliable. I think the question is more to say that that Europeans are still not able to defend themselves without the US. To a certain extent, we don't want to, because we think we are much better off politically and militarily with the US, because together with partners, you are always stronger. But to a certain extent, we don't even have the choice. So it's not a criticism about NATO. I think many countries, it's actually what we see now is the best example why Ukraine wanted to be in NATO. Mm-hmm. The Baltic states are terribly relieved to be in NATO. So it's not a criticism of NATO. It's more this kind of, in such a crisis, where would we be without the US? I mean, there are people who say, how would this have been play out with President Trump?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Although I was speaking with somebody recently who said that if President Trump were still in office, this would not have happened, which is not my position. But then again, who knows? Who knows? It comes back to your opening answer of there's so much that's unknown at the moment, and we can only think about it and anticipate. But while we're talking about the US and NATO, there have been a couple of questions about NATO, and one person is curious to know about NATO's continued expansion, and that undoubtedly was one of the factors that might have pushed Putin into this conflict at the moment, his desire not to have Ukraine as a NATO member state, and whether there isn't sort of another option for Ukraine. Couldn't Ukraine be a demilitarized buffer state rather than a puppet of Moscow? So I guess I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts, about NATO expansion, but also if this current conflict does overflow into other parts of Europe, into the Baltics, for example, which are members of NATO, do you think that Article 5 would truly be triggered? Do you think the rest of NATO would go to the defense of those countries?
So now we have about 10 questions.
And about 10 minutes.
Yeah, okay. I think the word NATO expansion is a wrong word. NATO didn't expand. Sovereign countries knocked on NATO's door and said, we feel threatened. We want to be part of this alliance to be on the safe side. So I think this is really important to think about the wording. Those countries wanted to join NATO because they feared Russia. One is tempted to say now, rightly so. And NATO was very reluctant to take them, actually. There were big debates about overstretch and can we really do that? Can we really defend them? And no, and it's going to break. So it's not NATO aggressively forcing countries to become members. It's states queuing up and getting through a long preparation process to join NATO. That for me is a really important difference, because the wording of NATO expansion implies NATO was proactively seeking to get larger. It didn't. And there was strong opposition. That's the first. The second point, for me, very important, is the idea of sovereignty. In the Helsinki Final Act, 1975, I think, Charter of Paris, we have the principle of sovereign states and the free choice of alliances. Countries can decide themselves which alliance they want to join. When Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014 and took Crimea, annexed Crimea, and took Luhansk and Donetsk in the Donbass, it wasn't because of NATO enlargement. It was as a consequence of the Euromaidan, when Ukraine said, actually, we want to move closer to the European Union. So the fear is far more the liberal Western democratic model than NATO, because the NATO announcement came in 2008. So I think we should not mix that up. But for me, the real crucial question for me is who decides about a country? Because this conflict is about Ukraine being a sovereign country or not. Can Ukraine decide itself whether it wants to be a demilitarized country? Can Ukraine decide itself whether it wants to join NATO or the EU? Or does the big brother on the other side has a word to say? And in our understanding of a Western liberal order, sovereignty, territorial integrity, free choice of alliances are key ideas. And what we see in the moment is Russia questioning those ideas. Ukraine wants to be a sovereign country. Russia says, we want to have a word to say. When Russia says, we don't want you to be a member of NATO, or if you look at the speech Putin gave, he said, Ukraine is not a country. They don't have a national identity, historically, never did. The idea is to question the sovereignty of a country. And that's why I find the whole debate about, can we not turn Ukraine into a buffer state? Can we not turn Ukraine into a demilitarized country? What about Ukraine, asking Ukraine what they want to be? I think it's not to the US and Russia to decide what the European countries can do. It's not about having a world. I don't want to return to a world of spheres of influence and big powers deciding above the head of smaller countries. And this is exactly what Russia seems to have in mind, to create buffer zones. But I would like to ask those countries in the buffer zones whether they want to be the buffer. And I'm sure the Baltic states and Ukraine don't want to.
Yeah. And I think that was part of the motivation for the Baltic states joining NATO, not wanting to be part of a buffer zone. And certainly part of the reason why there were those initial talks with Ukraine and even Georgia about the potential of joining NATO. But NATO is, of course, one multilateral group. Another one is the European Union. And we've not really talked about the coordinated European response that we've seen to Russia's invasion. And I did have a number of questions that I wanted to ask you about that. But I'd actually like to jump to a question that one of our viewers posed, which is Ukraine has expressed a desire for fast track accession to the European Union. And this is something that the Ukrainian president even just recently submitted a formal application for, asking for fast-track membership under a new sort of more simplified procedure. Under the circumstances, how realistic do you think it is that Ukraine would become a member state of the European Union?
I see it in the moment mainly as a very, very strong political signal to say you are part of our European family, you are welcome. That's a message to Ukraine. We support you, we stand really with you. And the message to Russia is we are not afraid. We stand with Ukraine. A real membership in the European Union, to be very honest, as much as I find it difficult to say it, I can't really imagine it in any time soon. Mm-hmm. That the political messaging to say, when Ursula von der Leyen said, we don't know what the exact wording was, but rephrasing, you are welcome. I mean, that's a message. It's strong in political terms.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the biggest country in Europe.
Yeah, and I think, I think I would agree with you. I think that right now this would be something far in the future, given all of the issues that Ukraine has too, in terms of being able to join the European Union. But in light of the conflict, it will be even more difficult. So, Claudia, this hour has gone by incredibly quickly, and we only have a few more minutes. A number of people have posed questions about what happens next. Several people have asked whether you see a possible exit ramp or a way of de-escalating the situation so that there's not more of a military buildup on both sides, but rather a de-escalation. In an event this morning, Wolfgang Ischinger suggested that there's a need for a third-party mediator that could help sort of facilitate talks between Russia and Ukraine and between Russia and the West. And so I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts about what happens next, both if Putin conquers Ukraine, what might happen next, but if Putin is not able to conquer Ukraine, what might happen?
I think we come back to the very basics of security policy. And one of the basics is 1967 Hamel approach. Hamel said security is a combination of deterrence and dialogue. If you only have deterrence, it's escalatory and dangerous. If you only have dialogue, I would add now, with a country who is willing to move borders by force and invade its neighbor, it's naive and irresponsible. So you need both. Hamel at that time back proposed a sequence, and he said, first build on assured deterrence, we reach out for dialogue. And I think that this sequence, but both legs, are really, really important. I think particularly in Germany, we had the tendency to focus very much on the dialogue bit, and we forgot a little bit about the defense bit or the deterrence bit. So we need to have those two legs ready to run, I would say. Of course, we need to try to find a format and get Russia at the table. On the other hand, I think we have to be very realistic. We have seen many European leaders in January, President Macron of France, Chancellor Scholz, trying to get Putin to the negotiation table. After Scholz's visit in January, we hoped that the Normandy format would be one opportunity to get back in touch. Some days later, Russia invaded the Donbass, totally kicking away each idea of diplomatic contact. So the impression we get in Europe is that the interest in dialogue is limited, and that we struggle, and we have a trust issue, let's put it that way. So I think, of course, we need to find a format to get in touch again and to find an agreement to reorganize security in Europe. But I think we have to be very realistic. This is a long-term problem, because if if the question, if I'm right in the analysis to say what Russia is interested in was the Donbass, Ukraine, and the European security order, because Russia is unhappy with the status in Europe, it wants to go back to a big power concert and spheres of influence, then our positions are not compatible. And if you have incompatible positions, we think sovereignty is okay. Russia thinks for smaller countries it's negotiable. Just give you one example. You think Ukraine should be an independent country. Russia doesn't think so. These positions, you don't get a compromise. So the question is how, on what topics can we start to engage again? Before the war, before Russia really invaded Ukraine, many people, including me, thought we could restart talks on things like transparency and exercises, arms control things. And then from those topics, kind of start moving next to it, kind of approaching again and finding a way to talk to each other. In the moment, I'm not sure of course, there's always the question of to what extent we can talk about the situation in Ukraine and finding solutions there. But the overall problem is something which we can only address in a very, very, very long-term perspective. That's why Zeitenwende is a real word. That's not, in Germany, we say it's not a weather change, it's a climate change. It's a long-term, it's a thing here, which is to stay, unfortunately.
Well, and so this will undoubtedly be a topic that will be occupying us and our attention for a long time to come. We can all certainly hope that the fighting in Ukraine comes to a halt in the near future, but that does not look likely. As you said, it looks like it's bound to be even more ugly and more brutal in this next phase. And so what we can do right now is sort of watch, but also send positive thoughts to the people of Ukraine, that they're able to continue to defend themselves and consider what we in the West can be doing to support them. And so it was an important sign, I think, that Olaf Scholz made the speech that he did, and that Germany is in the midst of this Zeitenwende. We at the ACG will continue to have discussions like this one as we try to unpack the German position, but also what's going on in Ukraine. And Claudia, I hope we can have you back again. This was a very insightful and informative conversation, and I just really want to thank you for that.
My pleasure. Always good to talk to you and discuss those things.
Well, thank you, and a huge thanks to our viewers as well. I think today's event was a record in terms of the number of viewer questions that were submitted. So thanks to all of you for your active involvement and active engagement. And I hope that you will join us again as we continue to try to figure out what's happening next and anticipate some of these next steps. But for now, stay well. And Claudia, all the best to you in Berlin. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. That was really excellent.